Drug and alcohol abuse is one of the major problems facing youth today. Children experiment with drugs at alarmingly early ages. In the United States, the average age for onset cigarette use is 5th grade. For alcohol is 6th grade, and for marijuana is 7th grade. However, recent surveys indicate that youth on the Flathead Reservation here in Montana are initiated into drug and alcohol use at even earlier ages. Native American children are particularly vulnerable to drug and alcohol abuse because of many factors, including economic, cultural, and societal factors. Perhaps the foremost factor involved is the widespread abuse of drugs and alcohol modeled to young children, reflecting that this is the norm. The state of Montana reports that 70% of the native population abuses alcohol. Therefore, 100% of Native people are directly or indirectly affected by substance abuse. This prevalent use of alcohol has become ingrained in reservation culture, thereby saying to young children, this is what it is to be Indian. Dysfunctional families is a term used to describe families that operate in such a way that the parents fail to meet the children's basic physical, social, emotional, and cognitive needs. Since children's basic needs are not met in dysfunctional families, the children also lack in self-esteem, guidance, cultural values, and problem-solving abilities. The parents within dysfunctional families are not meeting their children's needs because a chemical substance is in control of their abilities and their lives. It is not that these parents don't love or don't want their children. Also, adults who have not themselves experienced a healthy childhood have little to fall back on in order to provide a more healthy childhood for their family. Children who grow up in dysfunctional families learn to survive, and often by becoming chemically dependent themselves. Thereby, the generational cycle of substance abuse is perpetuated. The purpose of these video programs is to educate those who work with and teach young Native American children in order to break these cycles of chemical abuse. There will be 2 parts to this series of programs. Part 1 is entitled Supporting Children from Dysfunctional Families. Part 2 is entitled Ending the Cycles of Hurt. That is, how to provide children with information and skills before they are exposed to making decisions about drug abuse. Since the loss of a cultural identity and support system is a major issue in substance abuse, this video will incorporate issues relative to the Native American cultures on the Flathead Indian Reservation in regards to education, values, and traditions. Traditional cultural values and historical processes need to be rediscovered in order to envision a more positive future for children. This program, Ending the Cycles of Hurt, is designed to enable parents and others who work with young children to incorporate drug prevention activities and ways of relating to young children. Teaching children to just say no is not effective, nor are scare tactics. The first step we can take is to be role models.
I got a lot of double messages about alcohol, you know. In my family of origin, it was not good to be a drunk, but yet there were drunks in our family. And they modeled that behavior, and they were allowed to be a part of our family. I mean, they were allowed to come into the home and model that behavior, that drunken behavior. So if it was so wrong, then why did these other people, you know, were allowed to come in and do that? So I got, you know, a double message there.
So how do you teach a child? Well, we go to the nuclear family. Most of the time, children were taught by a very quiet method, that of observation. The parent, the mother and father, held the responsibility of how they conducted themselves between each other. And the children in turn would see this And just by that, they would learn how a husband treats his wife and how a wife treats her husband, and what work the wife does and what work the husband does. In short, the child was living in an educational system of how to be a human being. It can terrorize some people if they stop to think that their children are watching them. I remember as a kid, I learned how to open a beer bottle with my teeth, because that's what my father did. I learned that once my father slugged my mother, and I thought, But it was within a matter of minutes, my mother showed up with a frying pan and laid him out. And I said, no, don't ever hit your wife. That's bad news. But I learned a lot of other things by watching my parents. Think about it every time you sit home and you start screaming and hollering at your husband, or your husband screaming and hollering at you. Don't be too surprised if you find your children screaming and hollering at each other. Think about it when your husband hits you or you hit your husband, and what kind of lesson that's conveying to your children. Because you're their whole world. That nuclear family, the parent, that's the whole world that these children really have that matter. And if you do it, it's okay. That's what life is. And it's simply learning by observation. You're 30 years old, you're cool, you sit down on the couch and you toke up a little dope and you don't think anyone's watching or it matters. Don't be too surprised, because you can't tell your children, hey, you can't do that if you do it. It's that simple. So that's sort of terrifying, because if you think about it, in the old societies, the people knew this. They knew their children would learn by watching. And now we're still talking just the nuclear family. They learned many things by the experience of it. Did you ever watch Indian Family out in camp someplace? Watch them with the kids. They don't all do it, but a lot of the old-timers do it. Kid gets around the fire. Modern day families jump up, get away from the fire, you'll burn yourself, yak, yak. The kid doesn't really hear you. He just knows someone's hollered at him. But let him mess around, don't let him fall in the fire. Let him touch it. Once he touches that fire, there's a message that goes to the brain that he has that says, don't touch the fire. And no one had to say nothing. The old timers would sit around and let a kid get burnt. He just learned his first lesson. But they didn't let him destroy himself in the process. So what you start to see in society, and although it was a necessity in a survival society such as tribalism, and as the tribes had, the children learned by adults setting the example. Now sure, there were some kids, I'm sure, in those days, just as there are now, that are absolutely no good, period. They're not worth the powder it'd take to send them on the way. That's usually got some background to it, but that's usually too serious for us to deal with. What we're really concerned with is, why were our ancestors able to develop a society using the social order and social structure that lasted for tens of thousands of years and still managed to survive in the existence they had? And it starts with the family. It starts with a social order. It starts with the concept that the children are important, not just words. We use words. We talk a lot. But it doesn't really mean that we mean what we're saying. In an old society like that, where everyone's existence depended on everybody else, they had to mean it. And we're at a time in history where we're right back. The circle's completed itself. everybody's conduct, everybody's ability as a human being can affect everybody else around them and on this earth. So therefore, we're back in the system that we've talked about. The circle is gone in its full cycle, and we either correct some of the things we have now or we throw it away. Now the nuclear family, again. There were a lot of technicalities, the technical existence, how to make a knife, how to make a bow, how to make arrows, how to survive and exist. And you would think that all of this, like we have it now with these little closed family groups, we don't use our total family. We just sort of stay within ourselves. In those days, you'd think all of that was taught through the father and the mother. And actually it wasn't. But that was part of the key of how to form the society and use everybody in the nuclear family and then go into the extended family. How to use them to come in and make the family, the social order work. If you think in the lines that it was a highly complicated system, you're probably going to get somewhat confused. It was simple, and that maybe was the whole problem. It was so simple because it had one key word, and everybody had it. No one could turn around and give it to anyone else, no matter how hard they may try. It's what we see happen today. People give it away. They don't want it. But the key was responsibility. The nuclear family itself, children learn by observation. They learn by the contact of the love shared. And people don't realize this, but our ancestors loved each other and felt that closeness to each other just the way we do. They didn't have to put up with the terms of love that we have now with the stars bursting and the rockets and all that good stuff, which I've never managed to have yet. But they had a respect for each other, and that respect passed itself to the children. So it starts with a couple of words. The responsibility, everyone holding a responsibility. The other thing was a total respect. You respect yourself, you respect everybody else around you, and then it's like a good fast grass fire. No one stops it. Respect spreads. But with that comes your responsibility of how you're placed in the society.
Besides being a role model, certain messages should be communicated regularly to young children. The first of these messages is that you are special and you need to take care of your body. Some activities you could do with young children could be stressing the importance of eating right and putting only good things in our bodies, labeling poisons and discussing their dangers, and enhancing children's self-esteem.
In working with Indian children, what I like to focus on is their self-esteem, believing in themselves, believing in the positive aspects of their being. And I feel like the children, first of all, enter into an informal learning process in the family. And then from birth until they're in first grade or perhaps preschool age, then they may move into a formal learning process and some type of educational system. In order to survive today, they have to be aware of the factors surrounding their lives And when I work with them, I like to reinforce the fact that they are special. They have self-worth. They were created for a purpose, and they have a gift to give. When I was young, I was told that no one was created for nothing, and that's why I like to focus on that self-esteem, so as they might realize that they have something to contribute to mankind in their own special, unique way. Their informal learning process in the family at times might hinder their formal learning process. There's studies that reveal that Indian children think of things as a whole, meaning everything: the stars, the sun, the earth, the water, various elements, as well as the animals, and then mankind. And I feel with healthy self-esteem and some cultural awareness that can only benefit them in their lives. For some reason in the school system, I read in papers that they don't want to talk about a creator or a God. And I think that really is hurting the society in general, is harmful. And we're taught in our work area where I work sometimes to be sensitive to the fact that that's a topic you might want to really remain general and speak in general terms. And what I'd like to speak on is the fact that there is a creator, and with a child growing up with that knowledge, having some of that training, that can only benefit the child.
The second message to convey to young children is that drug abuse is not healthy for children or adults. Take advantage of teachable moments, for example, while watching a TV show or seeing someone intoxicated.
I share with my kids the thoughts I have, the struggle, and that encourages them to share with me. I'm in saying that and in modeling that, I'm telling them that that's okay for them to do it too. And as a result, I have kids who, when they experience drugs, because of my kids, I believe that apples never fall too far from the tree, that my kids are going to do it. So what am I going to do when that time comes? They're going to check it out because, most kids do. Am I going to get all upset about it, try to control it, try to, again, hold them away from that experimenting their environment? Or am I going to be a positive force in turning that back around? Letting them know I've given them all the information that I can to date on their potential to be alcoholic because they have alcoholic parents, alcoholic grandparents, and that this is a generational thing. I've had to sit with them and explain this whole genogram on my family and say, this is where alcoholism is, and this is where abuse of whatever kind is, and talk about that, and say, it's passed on. If we don't deal with it right here, if we don't look at it now, talk about it, seek help for it, then when you have kids, you have the potential to hand that on, pass it on. Because if we don't pass it back, we're going to pass it on. John Bradshaw talks about that in his tapes. We learn about, where we've been and where we're going, but we never learn about where we are. And that comes from sharing those and being honest with our children, and sharing the pain as well as the joy, and allowing our kids to feel whatever they feel and to have their experience and not stopping it.
The third message to communicate to young children is that your family is unique and you should depend on it for caring, support, and guidance. Set aside time to have family discussions and time to play. Enjoy each other.
If you look back in our history, basically an oral history, but we had what was called the coyote stories. The coyote stories, they're the genesis. They're the rules of life. They're how you conduct yourself in society. They're, if you do this wrong, depending on the animal in the story, they do something wrong, they pay a price for it. So what happens is that the elders, and usually during the winter because there's not much else going on, and that's the time the children sit and listen to coyote stories. And what's really happening here, the elders are showing and telling the children through an oral history how they began, how they were created, what were the expectations, where did they come from. They're teaching them something that we fail to teach our children now. One, they're giving them an identification. These children, just by virtue of the grandparents, knew who they were related to, who they came from, and most important, what was expected of them, the conduct expected of them in society. It's a very simple concept. You don't balance your life in all things, in your technology, in your social order, in your spirituality, and if you don't balance your life in that, then you'll destroy yourself in time. What we've had happen with all these changes, add to that the dominance of the government, then it's not unusual that we're looking at our families and our children in the state they're in right now. So what do? We start a re-education system. We start a rebuilding system. Someplace along the line, we teach our people now what they can be, what they could be, and probably what they will be. And it starts because they'll start then teaching their children. And maybe we'll all pull together and start being that family of man again. When that happens, we will start balancing our world. Children right now, do they really know who they are? Do they really know their responsibilities? Or do they know they have to have any responsibility at all? Or have we just brought them into the earth, into this world, and turned them over to society to raise, rather than raising them within the families? These are questions we have to look at. We have problems of alcohol, drug abuse, incest, physical abuse. We have massive problems. So we have some illnesses. They start in the family. And the family starts with the mother, the father, the brother, the sisters, whatever it may be. But it's not just there. It goes on from there to be the extended family. Everybody has a responsibility. And the children should be able to look at the nuclear family and the extended family and see nothing but examples of how to balance a world, balance their life. In education, we must work back to that. We must do some healing. And if we don't, then somehow we're failing in our responsibilities.
The fourth message to communicate is that you have rules to abide by. In order for young children to follow through with rules, they need to know what they are and why they were made. It also helps if the discipline to follow through with the execution of these rules is firm, fair, and consistent.
You know, in the area of discipline especially is something where I used to think that it was traditional because I heard stories about some of the things that were done in our culture, like in the early 1900s. I used to think it was traditional to spank your kids. because I heard that this man, well, whip man, was what they were called, would do public whippings. If someone was caught running off with somebody else's husband or wife, or somebody stole something from someone, or anything like that was a big deal, they would bring a person into a public gathering and put him on trial, sort of, and whip him if he was found guilty. And then I heard another story of where a lot of the older people had belts hanging in their house, and I grew up like that too, where there was a belt hanging somewhere. There was a belt somewhere that when you did something wrong, you got strapped for it. I didn't learn until recently that those teachings came in with the Jesuits, and they were encouraged, the Indian people were encouraged to spank their children, because this is what was taught from the Jesuit people. And when I learned that, I asked myself, then what was the way of discipline? And I also thought that the way of discipline was shaming, because that's in our culture even now. When you do something wrong, it's shame on you, and there's messages and there's different things that are done or said to you to make you know that you ought to be ashamed of yourself. That helps maintain that faulty attitude again about myself, in growing up in dysfunctional families. And when I learned that shaming was not a part of my culture, that was something also integrated in to fill a gap that was left because of the transition time, I had no answers. I had no way of knowing what was before these new teachings came in middle 1800s, early 1900s, somewhere in that space. But I've done some more reading and talking to people who might have heard something from their grandmothers or their great-grandmothers or whatever. And the way of discipline was when someone in a camp, let's put ourselves back in the societies before any influence of other cultures, when we still lived in the plain or out, in the Bitterroot and lived in the old way. There was a story of a man who did something wrong, and the whatever it was he'd done wrong was forgotten. But that the way that his tribal people dealt with it was the chief and his what would you call them? His people or his consultants, or they came together and they talked about what this man had done wrong. And the way that they decided that he needed to deal with it was that he would go off into the mountains and work it out with him and God. That he was to go, that wasn't a punishment, he was being set apart from his people to go up in the hills and to really think about what he had done, to acknowledge what he had done in the eyes of the Creator, not so much to the people, but to the Creator. And then when he had done that, then he was to come back into his society or into his tribal people and acknowledge his wrong and make amends to his wrong. That's powerful. To give a man responsibility for his own actions. That's something we've lost today too. People think that in disciplining, let's use for example, somebody comes home drunk and is real mean and is threatening his mother or threatening his grandfather or, just being physically threatening. Well, the grandma or the mom won't call the cops because, and I've heard this said from traditional people, is that Indian people don't do that. They don't call the law, or they don't, invite someone else in to take care of their problems. We take care of our own problems. We take care of our own. the famous statement, "We take care of our own," is keeping a lot of people stuck in destructive behavior. Well, if we look back and see how men were given responsibility for their wrongs, then if we can look at that today and say, when someone comes into my home and does anything destructive, I have a right to give him responsibility for his actions. And one way I can do that is to call the law and give him responsibility for, consequences to his actions. He needs to know that there are consequences to this behavior. We need to start saying that this is no longer acceptable. The children in our old societies were taught responsibility from, the times of learning how to walk and crawl, and the older children helped with that. I watched a movie one time where this little Eskimo, I don't remember what tribe of Eskimo, but he was sitting on a block of ice, and he was 1.5 years old, and he's eating whale blubber, and he's pulling it. I guess there's a way that you pull the fat off the skin. So he's pulling it like this, and then he's using those little flat knives, rounded knives. And as he pulls it, he swipes the meat, he cuts the meat clear. And every time, I even watched this in slow motion one time, this blade just rubs right across his lip. Today, if I saw somebody doing that, I would jump up and take that away from him. But these people, these Eskimos, sat back and watched him. And he was sitting up there in rhythm, eating this whale blubber and cutting. We don't allow our 1.5-year-old children to handle sharp objects, or, to even allow them hands-on experience with their environment today. We don't allow them to touch a stove to find out that they will get burned. We constantly try to keep them away from the stove. We need to allow our children to experiment in their environments, and not to be confining. We can say, this is your limits, because I'm uncomfortable with where you might go or what you might do if I allow you to have that experience. My grandmother always let me do what I wanted to do, but she was always assisting me, She was there to guide and direct, and I think that's what we're meant to be as parents, to be guides, to discipline our children when there is something really wrong or something that's, inappropriate behavior. We discipline them not in a way of shaming or in a way of putting them down for the choices that they've made, but by, setting up some kind of consequences to what they've done. Time out is a good one, for when kids do something wrong. And these are just things I've learned, and I continue to learn how to even raise my own children. Time out, or sentence writing, or, to give the kids the focus on what they've done wrong, by writing the sentence, not just writing it to be a punishment, but for them to really see that this behavior is inappropriate. I will not talk back to my mother. Writing it respectfully. I'm sure they didn't do this 200 years ago because they didn't have to. They had their ways of disciplining, and their boundaries were broader because they didn't have to worry about their kids getting hurt. They knew how to survive in their environment. We need to teach our kids how to survive in their environment again, but in a different way, using a different language, using different methods. And that doesn't mean that we're less Indian, and we need to, most of all, communicate with our children, which a lot of the generation right now doesn't know how to do. We can't even communicate with each other, let alone our children. So we need to learn how to do that, and take parenting classes, and reach out for people who are the resources to teach us how to do this.
The fifth message to communicate to young children is that education should be an important part of your life. Talk to your children about school. Talk about some of your positive experiences. Share with them photos of you in school. Arrange time to go to the library. Set aside time to read and to play games. Educators need to reflect perhaps the reverse of this message, and that is that they respect children's backgrounds and cultures. In so doing, children will feel that they belong in the educational program.
As a child, an Indian child, myself as an Indian child coming up on the reservation, there was they opened the squatters' rights on reservations sometimes in about 1903, which opened up to non-members to come on and settle on the reservation on unallotted land. And at the time, the communities weren't communities such as Polson, Ronan, St. Ignatius, Arlee, and Hot Springs. But with the opening that up to the non-Indians to the reservation, it started a process, an assimilation process, a hurried process. And very quickly, we had the dam going in on the river, the Flathead River. We had the lumber business starting to boom, and the communities expanded, starting the educational system in these communities that I mentioned. And along with the communities and the educational system was the Ursuline School that started in St. Ignatius. The Ursuline School was designed to take the young Indian students in and to teach them to read, write, and to be in good manner. Because the Indian families were abusing alcohol. They had the reservation closed to alcohol, but the bootlegging system found its way in. And many of the Indians at that time drank. And so, with the Ursuline system going, it started to deteriorate the culture. It deteriorated to almost completely nothing to today. We all know what happened. We hear over and over and over where we go, especially in a reservation setting where we hear of the Indian schools, the Catholic schools, punished and did this and did that. Well, that's several years behind us. And in my time and generation, the people are still feeling that pain. They're still feeling that pain of when they do something, and if it's not right, they'll be punished. So now their children are getting parts of that. The children that are coming up, my younger generation, if they don't do something right, it's automatic they get punished. Because we haven't stopped and addressed what has happened and has put it aside of us. The settlement was opened up, the public school systems opened up, the Ursulines tended to close down, the children were sent to the public schools. Okay, some of the Indians then practiced the culture. Some of the Indians then was ashamed of being Indian. At the time, it was better to marry either a white woman or a white man and get into the assimilative process and get an education so that we can all get a piece of the American pie. So we even had the division within our own reservation. The Indians divided themselves. We had the traditionalists, and we had the ones that wanted to be educated and to be like the American system. And that's still going on. That causes a lot of imbalancing. So now there's a sudden swing toward the identity of who we are as Indian people. Can I identify who I am? And there's all of a sudden the interest of cultural use, using cultural and tradition methods in living. And that's causing a problem because of the process of the assimilation. We've become codependent and spoiled by the system. It's better to go to Safeways and spend $5 on a pound of hamburger than to go out and look for your venison. It's better to go to get canned vegetables than to go out and dig the roots. It's better to go to the store and buy strawberry produce than to go out and seek the berries. We've changed over. And there's a swing to identify those and to utilize the value of it. And myself, as an Indian, I have to survive. I have to survive. And I got to compete with all these factors. I got to compete with all these factors that's going on in this society. And we'll enclose it into this reservation. If you look at the culture that we have left, and if nothing's done about it and identified, and if it continues to be ignored, and if it continues from an Indian's point of view, keeping saying, well, we still have the elders can do it. That's not going to work. 50 to 100 years from now, our language will be strictly English. And what we'll be learning, it will be out of the books. It will be the Boy Scout. The Boy Scouts will have more knowledge of Indians than the Indian. And so it would have to take a complete turnaround in interest in the language within this reservation. And that's even hard to do because you have the governing people, the councilmen, who are economically inclined to see a better reservation industrial-wise, educational-wise, and culture is far from their mind. They might be Indian on the outside, but in the inside they're trying to develop a monetary system to dominate on our reservation, meaning to build bigger and better things and neglect the cultural issue. So again, we get back to, well, we try to bring that into the school system. And we come up against closed doors many times. How do you get language into a school system? How do you get cultural activities into a school system? when football and basketball, sports, reading and writing dominated. We say we can do it at home. We can do it at home. The family can teach that. Well, we're so assimilated, we have to work too. We have to go out and pay the bills because of the way the society was set up. We have to pay our lights. We have to pay for our groceries. We have to pay for our kids' clothes. We have to pay for our own clothes. So how much time our children go to the school, we lose them to reading, writing, and arithmetic for 6 to maybe 8 hours a day. In the morning, you can't sit down with a child and say, now this is what we're going to do, some cultural activities. As soon as you get up, before you brush your teeth and wash, take a bath, and get dressed and get ready to go to school because you have to ride 20 miles to the school. But first we have to do this. It's not right because you only have a couple hours to do that with the child. And then the child is off to school. The child returns all day long sitting there learning about these basics of education and come home and they need time to rest, they need time to play. And by the time they get that out of their system, it's time to go to bed. So as an Indian person, I got to compete with that. I also got to work and concentrate on what I'm going to do. So we got to balance that out. And my belief is, I think non-Indians acknowledge the reservation situation to take an interest in doing something about it. The language, the traditions are practiced very few times in the year. The big thing happens, and those are the powwows. And that's a tourist, that becomes a tourist attraction for the non-Indians. And what they see, they see a good part of the negative side, the effects of the alcohol that goes in. And they don't see the value of what it is to learn to sing, to learn to dance, to learn to put your own outfit together, to learn those things that you do. So those are some of the things we have to compete with within our reservation setting here because of the different factors that's going on. It's just plain and simple. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be taken into consideration. Just as important as learning to read, just as important as learning to write, just as important to learning your math. All those things that the American system has, the traditions of the Indian has to be acknowledged also. It's that simple.
In communicating these 5 messages on a regular basis to children, parents, teachers, counselors, and others who work with young children can come together for a common cause. That is, to help children develop to their greatest potential, thereby ending the cycles of hurt.